Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Quetzal Talk. And today we have a really important guest here in El Paso. His name is David Romo. He's a historian here, and he likes to do, I guess, not the regular history that you hear, like the Wild West. He caters more to like talking about Mexican history and Mexican Americans and the raza history. How you doing, David?
I'm doing great.
Yeah, welcome,
Great.
welcome. Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me here.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a pleasure.
Hell yeah. So yeah, let's get right into it because I really want to know about like the history of El Paso, especially how the revolution was like influenced here.
Yeah. Well, what I write in my book, Ringside Seat to the Revolution, is that no other two cities played such an important role in helping to launch the revolution as did El Paso and Juarez. So that's kind of surprising, right? El Paso is a major launching pad for probably the first major social revolution of the 20th century. So how many like historical examples do you have of that? Of like say the French Revolution being launched from, I don't know, Belgium or whatever, right? Or Germany, right?
Yeah.
Or the Chinese Revolution being launched from Vietnam, right, from across the border. So El Paso is a very kind of unique city in that respect, that during the early 20th century, and so the official years of the Mexican Revolution is 1910 to 1920. But in my book, I argue that the revolution starts even before that. It doesn't start from one day to another. So I go back to 1890s when there was a curandera, a faith healer here, Teresita Urrea, and she was hanging out in the Segundo Barrio, and she was writing a radical newspaper, co-editing a radical newspaper against Porfirio Diaz. And a lot of people like her planted the seeds of the Mexican Revolution from El Paso. And the reason they would end up here is because they were kicked out by Porfirio Diaz, the dictator of Mexico at that time. And El Paso just was an ideal location to smuggle weapons, to write revolutionary newspapers. It had the largest Mexican American community in the United States at that time. So you can recruit, you can carry out espionage. So El Paso was just the ideal site to launch a revolution.
Yeah, and you say in one of your lines in your book, you say something that it was Spy City here, like at one point. Can you go into depth on the incidences that happened here?
Oh yeah. Well, in many cases, it was like West Berlin during the Cold War. Like there were spies everywhere. So I look at, there was a period there like in 1912 where the Mexican government sent a whole bunch of spies to check up on the arms smuggling. There were a lot of weapons and ammunition being sold from El Paso. El Paso makes a killing, just because they were selling so many weapons to both sides, to the federal government and to the revolutionaries. So there were a lot of spies kind of checking on that. And so I was finding evidence that there's this building near downtown El Paso called the Roberts Banner Building, that they were like triple spies. They were the spies that were checking on the spies that were checking on the other spies.
Yeah. So it gets all complicated and convoluted.
Yeah. It was kind of crazy, almost funny. But you had Pancho Villa. He had a spy, Enrico Llorente, and he was also his agent. So he would purchase not only ammunition, but he would purchase airplanes through El Paso. So we're talking about like 1914, 1915. Yeah. And so these were like the first airplanes in any revolutionary army in the world, right? So Pancho Villa and Llorente was trying to buy a Russian submarine at that time, So they were doing all kinds of crazy stuff that people didn't know about at the time. And it's only much later that the records end up in the archives and historians dig them up.
Yeah, and then you see all this crazy stuff that happened. So, Pancho Villa lived here for a time, correct?
That's right. So even before the revolution, Villa worked in El Paso. So there's some oral histories that he worked training roosters, fighting roosters, and in 1913 he was arrested by one of the federal agents, supposedly for stealing horses. Was just all BS. It was just a political thing. So he escapes from a prison in Mexico City, and he ends up in El Paso, and he lived at this hotel called the Roma Hotel, and now there's a Burger King there. It was knocked down a few years. Like the city doesn't take care of.
That's like important history. That's an important historical figure, and they just knocked it down for some burgers.
For a Burger King, and that's progress, right? So this city has never cared about like this kind of history, because to them, I guess it's Mexican history, and that doesn't count, right? The only thing people care about is the history of the Wild West. You go to the Concordia, and they have it all fixed up. His grave, and what was he? I mean, he was like a serial killer, right?
Right? I know, man.
And that's what we remember in the city.
Yeah, man. And then the buildings that do get taken care of, or the historical buildings getting taken care of, have more of a Anglo history, I guess.
Exactly. It's the history of the elite, right? So yeah, like you said, Raza, that's not history that's valid according to what gets saved and not saved in El Paso, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then, like we were talking before, we were saying how this history, like history of the revolution or Mexican American history, isn't really taught in schools. Like I knew nothing about El Paso history when I was growing up.
Me neither. So when I was doing research and I would come across a figure like Teresita Rea, I was just utterly fascinated by her. I mean, here was this 19-year-old curandera that was like the Selena of her time. Literally thousands of people would camp out in front of her home waiting to be healed. And there were 3 assassination attempts on her life. She ended up traveling throughout the United States, places like San Francisco, New York, winning a beauty contest. I'm like, oh my God, why hadn't anybody like taught me this history, right?
Yeah, and that's such a unique history. She's a curandera, but then she was so beautiful. People like loved her. That's crazy. And then, what was her continued role in the revolution, or is she was just the seed?
So you see, as early as 16 years old, people thought she had miraculous powers of healing, and she never claimed to be a saint or anything. But they called her a saint, La Santa de Cabora. But at the same time, it was during the time where Porfirio Diaz was kicking out the Yaquis from their lands, stealing their lands, and giving them to American companies, like mining companies and railroad companies. And she would, denounce that. And she would tell the Yaquis, yeah, you have every right to fight against dispossession, your land's being stripped from you. And they did. And so Porfirio Diaz obviously didn't like that. He couldn't kill a 16, 17-year-old young woman because he would have made her a martyr. So he sent her in exile. And that's how she ended up here in El Paso.
Damn. And let's see, there was other important like figures here too. Like I wanted to talk a little about Flores Magón. He lived here for a little while, and he was an important writer and I guess philosopher of the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, a lot of times he's been called the intellectual precursor of the Mexican Revolution, like that they laid the intellectual foundation. So a lot of the thoughts of the Zapatistas. So there's this real famous quote in the Mexican Revolutionary movement: "La tierra es de los que la trabajan." So the land belongs to those that work it, and that was a Magonista, anarchist type of slogan, right? That the land should belong to the communities, not to the capitalists and not to the state. So they were fighting for a different type of revolutionary movement. They didn't want to just replace one president with another, because no matter how liberal they seemed to be, like Madero was very liberal, but ultimately he was just a rich hacendado. It's kind of like today voting for Beto O'Rourke.
Yeah.
I mean, that guy is like a billionaire. He's a son-in-law of a billionaire. He has, millions of dollars. So, but he says all the right things, right? So Magón didn't want somebody that just says all the right things. He and his collaborators wanted to create a decentralized type of way of organizing yourself where you don't have one single precedent, but that the land and the factories belong directly to the workers, right? So these were ideas that were way ahead of their time. So we're talking 1906, and they were hanging out in Segundo Barrio in downtown El Paso, like in Overland Street, which was still part of the Segundo Barrio back then in 1906, and that's where the both governments of the United States and Mexico found them radically threatening, right? So they were both constantly sending spies to try to capture them, and they end up in jail quite a few times and come out and keep on fighting. So they launched about 3 different um, revolutionary insurrections here in El Paso against Ciudad Juarez, all along the border. So that was their idea of creating kind of a different kind of revolutionary movement that was not based on creating a state, but rather more more so kind of like how indigenous people related to each other, right? Their
Yeah.
leadership was based on, like, say, hey, you have the Ende people, the Apaches, and they have Geronimo as a war chief only when there's war, but once you're not in a battle, then it's like a fully democratic participatory.
Mm-hmm.
So they were not pushing for representation, but participation, that everybody has a say, not that you vote for some guy that's later going to sell us out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we I think we do need to talk about that too, like in our society, because there are a lot of flaws with this supposed democracy that we have.
Right.
And like you said, that what Magon was preaching for sounds a lot better, even though it might sound like idealistic to some. It does. I
Right.
mean, it sounds a lot better than we have now.
Yeah, and his critique was exactly right, because that's exactly what happened with the Mexican Revolution. It was just co-opted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even Madero, he kept the old system, the old judges, even the old military rulers, but now he had new rhetoric, but that didn't make a difference, right?
Yeah.
And you could say everything you want, but the system is so entrenched that he was trying to make like profoundly radical in the sense that he wanted to go to the roots of the problem and not just the skirt off the edges, just make something that profoundly changes society, not just one president for another.
Oh yeah, because like you said, just regime change. That's not going to change anything. That's just making other people, other cronies in power instead. So.
Right. So his ideas are still very popular. There's just a couple books that came out, Bad Mexicans, and it's about the Magonista movement. And then there was another one by Claudio Lomnitz, the Great Comrade Magon, or something like that. I forget the exact title, but his ideas and their ideas, the Magonista ideas, are still very relevant, and people find them that those ideas are old fashioned or idealistic. That their critique of power is still very relevant today.
Hell yeah, I agree, man. And then, is there any like where he was staying? Is there any like historical
Markers?
markers right
No,
now?
I mean, God Almighty, the city had a plan in 2006. There was the only marker to the revolution in South El Paso, and South El Paso was a major plotting ground. Was a marker that was not put up by the city. It was put up by a group from professors from, I think, Ciudad Juarez, that knew that it was where the first novel of the Mexican Revolution, Los de Abajo, the Underdogs, was written and published on Oregon Street, right in front of Sacred Heart Church in Oregon Street. And the city wanted to knock down that building, just like they wanted to knock down. Now, actually, thanks to my efforts, there is a marker in different places in downtown, and one of them is that Burger King that used to be kind of like the headquarters, the underground. We used to headquarters.
Yeah.
And I also helped to put up a marker where Pancho Villa would drink his strawberry sodas up at the Elite Confectionery. So there are some places where the La Junta de la Revolución at the Capos building, right on San Antonio and Mesa Street. So there are some places that now have markers. The Pancho Villa Stash House, But the city for a long time didn't care about these places. So and definitely nothing, no marker having to do with the Magonistas, and they were all along for sure. Oregon Street, Overland Street. You know, we have the addresses, and some of the buildings are still there. They used to be rooming houses, but no interest at all right now from the city to preserve them or commemorate them. It's just like they don't care. To them it's all junk. And for me, it's like if you find these old tomes of books from 200 years ago, 300 years ago, that yeah, they look junky, but if you sell them to a book collector, you can get sometimes thousands of dollars, right? And that's just
Yeah.
like an example of our riches. Just because they don't recognize it doesn't mean that they're not valuable.
Yeah, and then not just in terms of like money either,
Yeah,
just in terms of like our own historical value, like to us as a people too. I
absolutely.
mean, this is important history that
Yeah,
directly affected the city, and it should be
yeah,
honored.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, I use the money just as a metaphor for kind of their stupidity. That they're
Yeah,
throwing away stuff that they think is junk, but it's utterly valuable. Yeah, I have problems, and that's how they think. Politicians, you go up to them and you say, this is important. They'll say, oh yeah, we can bring tourism, and right away they want to commodify it, right?
hell yeah.
So yeah, it's good to bring in tourism, but even more important is to bring in the people from this community. And even if they don't buy beer or snacks, so what? It's history for our community.
Yeah, it's an education for yourself. The more you're aware of your past, the better decisions you can make for the future too, man.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like they say, the only thing we've learned from history is that people repeat history.
Oh yeah, man, and
They keep on repeating it. And sometimes it's because they're ignorant. And unfortunately, sometimes even when they know it, they still repeat it.
yeah, just
Hmm.
that greed takes over, I guess, for
Yeah,
whatever.
they just don't care. Just close their eyes to it, and they know they're doing the exact same thing,
Yeah.
but they have an interest in repeating it.
Yee, that's ugly, man. And
Yeah.
then, like we were talking about earlier, like just the how there's an interest of like I guess the elites wanting to stay in power and how they don't want us
Hmm.
to understand our history. Can you go
Hmm.
into depth about that? Like what we were talking
Yeah, like
about?
several years ago, in Arizona, the local politicians, most of them conservative Republicans, passed a law to make Mexican American studies illegal in the Tucson school district. And for many years, I mean, at first the school officials went in and just got rid of all the books that had to do with Mexican American studies in these classrooms. And the kids were like, why are you taking away our knowledge? Knowledge is power. Why are you doing this? And there were a lot of protests. Finally, after many years, the court decided that that was a racist thing to do. But in the meantime, for many years, a lot of kids couldn't study their own history, even though these classes were extremely popular, and there were studies that it was helping high school kids. Uh, the graduation rates among the kids that actually studied their own history was much higher than those that didn't among the Mexican American student population, because it meant something to them. It was relevant. They weren't just studying the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock. They were studying
Yeah,
about stuff that had to do with their parents and grandparents and
yeah.
their
How
own
we came
ancestors.
here, like I'm like yeah, it's important, I guess, how like the Pilgrims and all them came to America,
Right.
but I mean Mexicans were kind of here first in a
How,
way,
how
and
in many ways, when the Pilgrims came, what was the first food they ate? Mexican food, right? They were eating beans and squash and corn. That comes from Mesoamerica, right? So that kind of migration between Mesoamerica and what is now the American Southwest was going on literally for thousands of years. Like they just found some footprints up in White Sands, New Mexico, that were 23,000 years old. So that means a lot of our ancestors, and most of us, yeah, we have Hispanic ancestry from Spain, but most of us have more indigenous native ancestry from this part of the world, right? Whether it be Mexico or the Southwest.
and we don't even talk about it too. Like everyone, like you said, just knows about our Spanish history, but no one knows what tribe we're originally from. No one, everyone, like it's sad.
Exactly.
It's all forgotten.
Exactly. And even in El Paso, I mean, the most that you might know is the missions and maybe the Tiwas, but they don't know that when you go to the UTEP campus or downtown El Paso or Duranguito, that used to be called the Pueblo de los Mansos because they were the first indigenous people that the Spanish Europeans encountered when they crossed in through Paso del Norte. There was a ford where you could cross through the river, and it was the native people that taught them where to cross it. And that happened first in 1581 and then in 1598 here in this part. And that's 20, 40 years before Plymouth Rock, right? So when they call us the other Ellis Island, I said, no. You're the other El Paso del Norte.
Yeah,
we precede you, right? There was a lot. And that wasn't the most important thing. Like I said, indigenous people had been here at least 23,000 years before that. But that's hidden, right? Even in the word Hispanic, there's this kind of wanting to be white, right? Because that makes it sound more European. Or Latin, I don't speak Latin.
Right.
Habemus papam, I don't speak Latin. So why are you calling me Latin or Latinx or Latino or Latina? I don't know. I don't like those phrases. I know a lot of people, well, out of convenience, that's what they call themselves. Yeah, but that erases a big part of who we were, the native part.
Yeah, exactly. And then it just categorizing such a huge group of people. Like you get South Americans, Central Americans, like a bunch of people. Like, I mean, a lot of people don't have any like ethnic, I guess, connection together, and that's just too much people to categorize in one group.
Yeah, but it's I mean, I don't mind. So this is my very personal way. Like when we are treated as a race is a social construct, but we're treated more as a brown race. And that goes into like native people and Mexican Americans or Mexican nationals that are here and other groups. So there's that element of colorism, right? But because Hispanics are considered white, but we've never been treated really like white. It's more like off-white, because we still historically face school segregation, neighborhood segregation, lynchings. People don't know that between, say, the 1848 and the 1920s, there were more than 600 confirmed lynchings.
600?
More than 600. Damn. Because those are the ones that scholars can actually identify.
Oh, okay.
A lot of times, like the Texas Rangers would go in and kill maybe hundreds of people in South Texas.
Or places out in the boonies that you don't even know about.
Right. But the ones that we do know that were getting mob lynchings were at least 600.
And was it mostly of Mexicans or was it also of like African Americans?
Oh, no. We're talking, no. African Americans have their own numbers. We're talking of just either Mexicans or Mexican Americans who were born in the United States. Yeah. And that history is not, part of who we were. So these words like Hispanic and Latin, they make you sound like we're, when you fill out the census, you can only put white as an ethnicity. And I'm like, and you can't put native unless you're tribally affiliated to an official tribe. And that's done on purpose, right? That's done to erase and disconnect us from ancestors that did have connections to these lands. And that all has to do with the politics of who owns America, who gets to decide who comes in and who's excluded, right? And it's very subtle and not so subtle. But history is a big part of how we determine things that are going on today.
So that's interesting. So just with that category, like they're able to, I guess, seize, like we don't have that power, I guess, like to say that we were here because we're calling ourselves white. We're not saying that we were from here originally, so we don't have an entitlement to here.
Exactly. So that's a very subtle way of preventing you from learning that, that, for thousands of years, Mesoamerica and what's today the borderlands, the southwest borderlands, were connected by these trails that later becomes the Camino Real. And even the Camino Real preceded, these mass migrations across the ocean. So I do think there's a political agenda in what histories we can learn. Like now it's illegal to learn critical race theory. So what is critical race theory? First of all, it wasn't even taught at the high school or elementary level, much less at the elementary level. It was usually taught at like graduate programs at universities. And critical race theory looks at systemic racism, not just that somebody calls you the N word or a wetback or whatever, right? It's systemic racism that has to do with how one group of people, namely whites, Anglos, stay in power by controlling the stories and the narratives, controlling the institutions, and systematically making sure that they maintain their racial superiority. But they say, "Oh no, this is colorblind. It's not about race, but it's always been about race." And yes, race doesn't exist, but racism does, right?
Yeah, we made it exist in our way, in our minds, and
Yeah,
in our
yeah,
like subconscious agreement, I guess. That's
yeah.
horrible.
So there's a lot of internalized racism as well. That's why most of our brown people are now joining the border patrol, because there's so many opportunities financial, but they're literally running over immigrants. There's just there it's a way of repeating the strategies of colonization. When the Americans wanted to capture Geronimo, who would they hire? Another group of Apaches. And then once that group of Apache scouts helped the U.S. Army capture the hostile Apaches, the ones that were resisting colonization, what happened? They both were put in a train, sent to prison in Florida, right? And so those histories of colonization, of divide and conquer, are still here with us.
Just in more subtle bureaucratic ways now. They can.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. And
man.
so that's why they don't want to teach you that. They don't. So critical race theory says that, this land was founded on slavery and the theft of land, of it, brown land, right? Both indigenous and Mexican lands. And that was always part of their ideals, Slavery was part of the ideal of America. It wasn't just oh, we failed to live up to our ideals.
Yeah.
So the Republicans say that that's how you can teach slavery, and they don't even call it in slavery. They called it involuntary relocation or something like that, right? That they proposed to not use the word slavery anymore in Texas school books for elementary school children.
That's horrible.
Yeah, it is horrible. So our history has become illegal, basically. And so, yeah, once you make history illegal, then you make people illegal. You make them transient. You make them feel like they have no roots in this part of the world, that they could be deported, just like they were during the 1930s, where you have between 1 million and 2 million Mexican Americans and Mexicans. The majority were Mexican Americans. They were young people who were illegally deported. And you can't deport somebody that was born in this country, but they did it anyway. Why?
Yeah.
Because of race.
Huh, man. And there was never any in I guess now there has never been like recompensation for that mistake, or
People have been pushing for the government to recognize and apologize, then reparations, and they've refused to do it, right? California actually did push for like a state apology, and they apologized. But yeah, all those, it was between 1.2 million to 2 million people that were deported. Some of them are still alive. Nobody ever got any kind of reparations. There was no, and there's usually no knowledge of it. It is not taught in the history books for school children.
yeah, and like not even high school or college, even you don't even hear like, and even in UTEP, you like when I go into the history department, there's like you would expect a class to at least brush on El Paso history, but nothing.
No, it's always seen as kind of second class history. That's why I'm very happy doing public history here in El Paso. I work as a consultant right now, and I do a lot of projects both with museums, and in this case, this Saturday there's going to be at 4 p.m. Starting at 4 p.m. at the old Sheepdog. There's going to be kind of a history festival that celebrates the forgotten histories of El Paso, and I'm the consultant of that project, and I'm very honored to be part of that. And that's what I'm trying to do, kind of bring back these forgotten, erased, ignored histories, and sometimes deliberately repressed histories, right? In the case of Texas, for instance. So I'm very happy doing that kind of projects rather than kind of more academic. And I'm not saying, academic history is also very important, but but I don't feel as comfortable in that kind of role. I much rather bring it out to everybody.
To the people don't, yeah, because academics sometimes seems like it's trying to be itself inclusive to a certain people, like it's trying to keep like certain information and certain like history to a certain class of people sometimes.
Maybe not deliberately, but I think academia, yeah, keeps it, and the kind of history that is done is more, I don't know, esoteric, more, yeah, it doesn't get out to most of the community. There are exceptions, like for instance, I collaborate with Dr. Yolanda Leiva, and she's a public historian, and she's out there, rolling up her sleeves trying to bring the history to the community itself. So of course there's a lot of exceptions, but I'd much rather just dedicate myself full blast to public history.
Yeah, yeah, and that's important work. I mean, you're doing a great endeavor fighting back on the powers that want to keep our, like, I guess, our history
Mm-hmm.
from us. So thank you, man. That's really cool. And is that the only event that's gonna happen soon, or is there gonna be other
So I'm
events?
going to give a series of walking tours, and after this event, there'll be and maybe they can check with you. We'll have a place online where you can register for walking tours. So one of them, November 26th, is a walking tour. Actually, it's a driving tour. Like we'll be on a bus and we'll get out and walk and back in the bus on the important sites of the Mexican Revolution.
Oh man, that sounds
Yeah,
fun. That sounds cool.
yeah, and then another one will be let me see if I remember. So South Central El Paso, so places in like where the Coliseum, Washington Park, La Jeff, Jefferson High School, Escarate, how important those places were, and people don't know like the history of the Coliseum, for instance. That was where the POWs, Italian POWs, were held in a prison camp. Later, the braceros, the Mexican guest workers, were there in the 1950s. And of course, La Raza Unida party of the Chicano movement in 1972 was held there. John Kennedy was there 4 years before he became president of the United States. Uh, Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, like the heavies, of course, Selena was there. Elvis Presley was there in 1956, again in 1972. So there's all these incredible histories that people just don't know about. And you can just walk around the Coliseum and you're learning about how like the world came to El Paso and history was made there as well. So those are the kinds of stories that we're going to tell in these walking tours.
Oh yeah, that sounds exciting, man. So you said there isn't a website set up yet?
No, it's gonna this is a brand new program. So
Oh,
right
okay.
immediately after um, November 5th, there's gonna be an event that takes place from 4 to 8 at the old Sheepdog and right next to the Lincoln Center. Um, and so they'll have places where you can sign up for those walking tours, and they'll
Okay.
also kind of they'll have something where they'll direct you to how to register for them online.
Oh hell yeah, and I'll keep my lookout and make sure to post it online because that's really
Yeah.
fun and it's
Yeah,
really
one
cool.
of them is going to be all the sites for the Pachuco lowrider movement. So that's
Ah, that
totally
one's gonna be
counter
exciting.
history. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people will be excited for that one too.
Yeah,
So
hopefully. Yeah, hopefully there'll be interest. And I think there is. I think there's a lot of interest to learn our own history of our city, that directly shaped who we are today.
hell yeah, man. I mean, and it's important. So I don't want to take up too much of your time because I know you have other things to do. So is there anything else before we get going that you would like to the people to know?
Uh what I mean, I think it's important for all of us to reconnect to who we were, and there's so many tools now. You can. It used to be that I had to go to the physically to the library and check out all these historical records, and now you can do it online. Everybody should talk to their own grandparents that are alive, or parents, grandparents, and ancestors, and really document where we come from, right? And have different perspectives, not just the official perspective of what our history was, but start with the family history. So that's what I encourage people to start with their own genealogies and then connect it to the bigger story.
Hell yeah, man, that's fascinating. And thank you very much for having us.
Oh,
And
thank you so much, man. This is a pleasure.
and I hope to
Thank you
talk
for
to
your
you
interest.
again. You're such a,
Yeah.
I guess, a font of knowledge, a
Oh,
fountain of
man.
knowledge. So it'd be
Oh,
cool.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. Anytime you want to sit down and talk about history, I'm very willing to do that.
Awesome. And remember, everyone, this Saturday at the Sheepdog Brewery, come check out the, what was it called again?
So, Corazón, Historia Raíces, heart, history, and roots.
Hell yeah, go check that out starting at 4 p.m. All right, everyone, thank you. And thank you, David. You have a good
Thank
day.
you. Andale. Thank you so much.